Have you ever stopped to wonder what the true meaning of your life is? Are you living a life of purpose? Or are you letting the years slip by, consumed by things that don't truly matter? What is the most precious thing in this world? And are we using the time we're given for something meaningful, something real? In the heart of a bustling city, where time never slows and people rush through their lives without a second glance, a small boy stands on the corner of a crowded street. His voice rises above the noise, a song so pure, so filled with innocence, that it seems to make time stop. People walk past him, indifferent and preoccupied, barely sparing him a glance. To them, he's invisible, just another shadow blending into the chaos. But not everyone looks away. When Isabel, a wealthy and successful woman, stops to listen, she has no idea that this fleeting moment, a boy's song echoing in the evening air, will be the catalyst that shatters her carefully constructed world. A single note awakens something in her, something long buried beneath years of ambition and routine. What follows is a journey, hers and her husband's, to rediscover what truly matters, to find a life filled with meaning, and to understand that the most profound moments can come from the simplest of voices. Sometimes, it takes the smallest light to illuminate the darkest corners of our hearts. But before we dive into the story, let us know where you're watching from. And if today's story warms your heart during this cold winter season, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more heartwarming and emotional stories. Now, let's begin this journey together. The city was a symphony of chaos. Honking cars stuck in endless traffic, hurried footsteps pounding against the concrete, and voices of impatience blending into a restless hum. The tall buildings loomed over the streets, their windows reflecting the orange hues of the fading sun. The air was thick, not just with summer heat, but with a collective sense of urgency, as if every person in the city had somewhere better to be. Amid the noise and bustle, on the corner of 5th and Monroe, stood a boy. He was small, barely noticeable among the sea of people. His clothes were a little too big for his frame, his faded coat worn at the edges as though it had weathered too many winters. His shoes, scuffed and mismatched, peeked out from beneath his baggy jeans, one sole almost flapping as he moved. In his hands, he gripped a toy microphone, a plastic remnant of some forgotten birthday, its edges chipped and scratched. And yet he sang. His voice, surprisingly clear and sweet, rose above the chaos like a bird taking flight. It wasn't loud or trained, but it carried a kind of purity, a note of innocence that cut through the sharp honks and muffled footsteps. It was the kind of voice that made you stop, if only for a moment, and remember something you didn't even realize you'd forgotten. The boy's name was Eli. He was 12 years old and had Down syndrome, though that wasn't what you noticed first. No, what struck you was his smile, wide and unshakable, as though the entire world's troubles rolled right past him without leaving a mark. His small shoulders swayed to the tune only he seemed to hear, his head bobbing as he sang into the broken toy microphone like it was a stage mic at a grand concert. This little light of mine, I'm going to let it shine. It wasn't just the words, but the way Eli sang them, his voice trembling slightly on the higher notes but never faltering. His joy was magnetic, even in the face of complete indifference. People passed by, businessmen in tailored suits, women in heels clicking hurriedly on the pavement, teenagers lost in their headphones. All of them glancing, but none stopping. They saw him, perhaps just for a second, but then moved on as though he were a ghost. One man tossed a quarter into the small jar at Eli's feet, without even slowing his steps. The coin clinked loudly in the otherwise empty jar, and Eli paused mid-verse to beam at him. "Thank you, sir," he called out, his voice full of genuine gratitude, though the man had already disappeared into the crowd. Eli's mother always said he had a gift from the heavens, and while others might have dismissed his singing as the sounds of a street kid, there was something undeniably special about him. His voice wasn't perfect, but it was honest, raw and untamed, untouched by judgment or fear. It was this honesty that filled the space around him, transforming the chaotic corner into something sacred. The sidewalk where Eli stood wasn't particularly remarkable. It was worn and cracked, gum smeared into its crevices, a discarded coffee cup rolling lazily in the breeze. The surrounding buildings loomed tall, windows tinted to keep out the sun, as cold and detached as the people who walked beneath them. But with Eli singing, the corner seemed different, like a patch of sunlight breaking through storm clouds. At one point, a group of teenagers passed by, snickering as they pointed at him. "What's with the kid?" one muttered to his friend, their laughter cruel in the heavy air. Eli, unfazed, turned to face them, his smile as bright as ever. "Do you want to sing with me?" he asked, holding out the microphone. The teenagers fell silent, caught off guard by his invitation, before quickly turning and walking away, their laughter fading into the distance. Eli just shrugged and started singing again, undeterred. He didn't sing for applause or praise. He sang because it made him happy. The corner wasn't Eli's stage. It was his sanctuary. Here, beneath the indifferent gazes of strangers and the relentless noise of the city, he created his own little world, one note at a time. A world where innocence still mattered, where kindness still existed, and where his little light could shine, unbothered by how small it might seem to others. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, painting the horizon in shades of gold and purple, a cool breeze swept through the streets. Eli's voice carried with it a soft melody that refused to be swallowed by the noise. A woman passing by paused for a moment, her gaze lingering on him longer than most. She looked tired, the weight of the day etched onto her face, but as Eli sang, something in her expression softened. He caught her eye and waved excitedly, his toy microphone held high. "Hi there," he called cheerfully. The woman smiled faintly, a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, but she dropped a few bills into his jar before moving on. Eli didn't count them. He just beamed and called out, "Thank you, ma'am. I hope you have a happy day." The woman turned back slightly, surprised, her face softening further before she disappeared into the crowd. Eli kept singing. To the rest of the world, he was just a boy on a corner, one more unnoticed soul in a city full of distractions. But for those who stopped, even for just a second, Eli was something else entirely. A reminder, a breath of fresh air, a voice cutting through the noise to say, it's okay to stop, it's okay to listen, it's okay to feel. And in a city where time moved too quickly, that was more precious than anyone realized. The sound of clicking heels and polished loafers filled the sidewalk as pedestrians streamed down the busy street. Among them walked Isabel Foster and her husband Henry Foster, a power couple whose very presence seemed to command attention. Isabel's ivory-colored dress suit was perfectly tailored, her blonde hair swept into an elegant twist, and her diamond earrings glinted under the city lights. Henry, tall and sharp-featured, wore a charcoal suit so immaculate it looked untouched by human hands, paired with a crimson tie that seemed to scream power and precision. They moved with purpose, or at least Henry did. He strode ahead, his eyes glued to the glowing screen of his phone as his thumb scrolled through emails with practiced efficiency. Isabel followed a step behind, her pace slightly slower, her gaze wandering as though searching for something she couldn't name. "Henry, you're going to run into someone," Isabel called, her tone half exasperated, half teasing. "I'll be fine," he replied curtly, not bothering to look up. "Did you see the message from Langley Investments? They're expecting us to confirm the deal tonight. This gala isn't just for show. It's a chess game, and we need to move the right pieces." Isabel sighed, suppressing the instinct to roll her eyes. Langley Investments. The name had become a buzzword in their lives over the past month, mentioned during dinners, car rides, and even in the quiet hours of the night when Henry muttered strategies in his sleep. It was always about the next deal, the next step toward bigger things. For Henry, tonight's gala was a milestone, a chance to solidify their business alliances and further his company's reach. For Isabel, the evening was shaping up to be just another soulless event, a room full of people smiling too widely, talking too loudly, and caring too little. She pressed her clutch against her side and picked up her pace, matching Henry's stride as they approached the intersection. And then she heard it. It wasn't the blaring horns or the sharp hum of city noise. It was something soft and sweet, weaving through the chaos like a fragile thread of calm. A voice, clear and full of feeling, floated over the crowd, singing a song that Isabel hadn't heard in years. She slowed, her heels scuffing slightly against the pavement. Her eyes darted toward the corner, where a small figure stood beneath the glow of a flickering streetlight. There, gripping a toy microphone as though it were made of gold, was the boy. Eli. Isabel's breath caught. His voice rose above the rush of the street, thin yet unwavering, like sunlight peeking through storm clouds. He swayed on his feet as he sang, his worn coat flapping gently with his movements. The way he smiled, pure and unshakable, seemed to pull something deep inside her chest. Henry, already a few paces ahead, turned sharply when he realized Isabel wasn't by his side. Isabel, he called, his tone impatient. She didn't respond, her eyes still locked on Eli. "What is it?" Henry asked, retracing his steps. When he followed her gaze, his expression soured. "Oh, for heaven's sake. It's just a street kid," he muttered, waving a dismissive hand in Eli's direction. "Come on, we're already late." Isabel finally tore her eyes away, looking at Henry with furrowed brows. "Do you hear him?" she asked softly. Henry blinked at her, incredulous. "What? Do you hear him sing?" Henry frowned and glanced briefly back at Eli, whose voice still carried through the noise. "Yes, I hear him, and so does everyone else. That's the point, isn't it? He's trying to get people to notice him. Now can we please go?" "It's not like that," Isabel replied, her voice distant, as if she were speaking more to herself than to him. Henry let out a sharp breath, running a hand through his hair as frustration flickered across his face. "Isabel, don't do this. We don't have time for whatever. We're expected at the gala in 30 minutes, and there's traffic. I can't afford to stand here while you get distracted." "I'm not distracted," Isabel said firmly, though her eyes lingered on Eli. Henry laughed humorlessly, gesturing at the boy. "You're staring at some kid singing into a toy. He's probably out here every day. This isn't new, Isabel. He's not special." But Isabel couldn't ignore the pull in her chest. The way Eli's voice seemed to silence the noise around him. There was something there, something she couldn't put her finger on. It wasn't just the singing. It was the joy in it, the unshakable happiness that radiated from him despite everything around him. She looked closer, noticing his shoes, one so worn it was nearly coming apart. His coat was too big, the sleeves frayed. And yet, there he stood, singing as though the world was made just for him. "Henry," she said quietly, her voice steady, "just give me a minute." Her husband's jaw tightened. "A minute? For what?" "To listen." "Listen?" Henry's voice rose slightly, his exasperation clear. "To him?" "Isabel, we don't have minutes to waste. We have a deal to close, people to impress. This isn't important." Isabel turned to face Henry, her eyes soft but resolute. "Maybe that's the problem. You don't think anything is important unless it's tied to business." Henry flinched as though she had struck him. For a moment, his face was unreadable, a flash of something almost vulnerable before his usual stoicism returned. "That's not fair," he said, quieter now. "Isn't it?" Isabel countered, her gaze unwavering. "When was the last time you stopped and noticed something real, Henry? Something that didn't have a dollar sign attached to it?" Henry opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. Instead, he shook his head and stepped back, his frustration simmering. "Fine," he said sharply. "If you want to stand here and listen to a kid sing in the street, go ahead. But I'm going to the gala. We'll talk about this later." With that, he turned and strode away, his figure quickly swallowed by the crowd. Isabel didn't watch him leave. Instead, she turned back to Eli, whose voice hadn't faltered through the entire exchange. He looked up then, catching her gaze, his smile growing even brighter. "Levi," he called out between verses, lifting his toy microphone like he was performing just for her. Isabel couldn't help it. She smiled back. "You have a beautiful voice," she said, her words carrying over the hum of the street. "Thanks." Eli beamed, his cheeks flushed with excitement. For a moment, Isabel forgot the gala, the expectations, and Henry's parting words. She stood there on the busy street corner, listening to a boy who sang not for attention, not for money, but for the simple, uncontainable joy of it. It was just a song, just a moment. And yet, Isabel couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, that something in her heart had been unlocked. The sound of Eli's singing wove through the chaos of the city like a golden thread, thin but unbreakable. It cut through the noise of honking cars and impatient conversations, rising into the evening air with the quiet insistence of something too pure to ignore. Isabel stood rooted to the spot, her eyes fixed on the boy. His small body swayed gently as he sang, the oversized coat hanging loosely off his shoulders, frayed edges fluttering in the breeze. His face was flushed from the effort, yet his smile never faltered. He held the toy microphone close to his lips like it was a sacred object, as though he believed his voice could reach something, or someone, far beyond this crowded corner. This little light of mine, I'm going to let it shine. Eli's voice was light, carrying an innocence that no noise, no cynicism could drown out. It was as if the moment belonged to him alone, the rest of the city fading into the background while he poured his heart into every word. Isabel blinked, feeling her throat tighten unexpectedly. She didn't know why it affected her so deeply. Maybe it was the boy's joy, so out of place in the hard, unrelenting city. Or maybe it was the sight of his coat, threadbare and patched, or his shoes, with soles nearly worn through. Yet, he wasn't asking for pity. He wasn't asking for anything at all. He sang because he loved to, because the song seemed to live inside him, waiting to be let out. Isabel. Henry's sharp voice broke through her trance like glass shattering. She startled, turning to see her husband striding back toward her. His expression darkened with frustration. "What are you doing?" Henry demanded, his voice low but clipped. "I told you, we don't have time for this." Isabel shook her head slightly, as though trying to clear it. I needed to listen." "To this?" Henry's tone was incredulous as he gestured toward Eli. "It's just some kid on a corner, singing with a broken toy. You're acting like it's... Will you stop for a second?" Isabel snapped, her voice sharper than she intended. Henry blinked, surprised by her outburst. Isabel softened her tone, but stood firm. "I know you don't understand, but just look at him, Henry. Really look." Reluctantly, Henry turned his gaze toward Eli, who was now oblivious to their conversation. He sang on, the chorus repeating with a childlike conviction that made it hard to dismiss entirely. But Henry's expression remained hard, unmoved. "I don't see what you see," he muttered, shaking his head. "It's a song, Isabel. That's all it is. Do you know how many street kids are out here every day? Singing, playing, holding out cups for change? It's nothing new." Isabel's heart ached at his words. Not because they were untrue, but because of how easily he said them, how quickly he dismissed something she found so beautiful. "That's not the point," she said softly, her eyes drifting back to Eli. "He's not doing this for money. He's not even asking. Look at his face, Henry. He's happy. When's the last time you saw someone so happy for no reason at all?" Henry opened his mouth to argue, but something in her expression stopped him. He let out a frustrated sigh and ran a hand through his hair, his focus darting back to his phone. The screen lit up with an incoming notification, and his jaw clenched. "Isabel," he said, his voice measured but firm. "We're already late. People are expecting us. Langley's team is waiting. If we don't show up, what does that say?" Isabel looked at him, at the tension in his shoulders and the way his phone seemed permanently glued to his hand, as though every second away from it would unravel their carefully constructed lives. "Maybe it says we're human," she replied quietly. Henry blinked, caught off guard. "What?" "Maybe it says that we stopped, just for a moment," she said, her voice soft but steady. "To notice something, to appreciate something real." Henry stared at her, as though she had spoken a language he didn't understand. He glanced back at Eli, his gaze briefly lingering on the boy's small figure, still swaying as he sang. But whatever he saw wasn't enough to change his mind. "This is ridiculous," Henry muttered, pocketing his phone. "You can't seriously want to stand here and listen to..." Isabel interrupted firmly. "And you don't have to. Go ahead to the gala. I'll meet you there." Henry's mouth fell open slightly, disbelief clouding his face. "Are you serious?" "Yes." The word hung between them, heavier than Isabel had expected it to be. Henry stared at her, his frustration turning into something closer to hurt. He searched her face for some explanation, something to make sense of her sudden defiance. But Isabel didn't waver. Henry exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "Fine," he said, his voice flat. "Do whatever you want. I'll see you at the gala." He turned on his heel and walked away, his steps brisk and deliberate, as though he could shake off his irritation with every stride. Isabel watched him disappear into the crowd, a pang of guilt tugging at her chest. But she didn't follow. She couldn't. Instead, she turned back to Eli. The boy finished his song and grinned, as if he'd just performed for the largest crowd in the world. His eyes caught Isabel's, and he waved his microphone excitedly. "Did you like it, lady?" Isabel smiled, tears pricking at her eyes for reasons she couldn't quite explain. "I did. Very much." "Thank you." Eli beamed, his joy infectious. "What's your name?" Isabel asked gently. "Eli," he said proudly, puffing out his chest a little. "Well, Eli," Isabel said softly, crouching down so they were at eye level, "you have a beautiful voice. It's very special." Eli's cheeks flushed, and he shrugged modestly. "I just like to sing. It makes people happy." Isabel swallowed hard, her throat tightening. "It made me happy," she whispered. For the first time in what felt like years, Isabel felt present, truly present. The world around her had slowed, the noise and chaos fading into a distant hum. All that remained was the boy, the song, and a feeling in her heart that she couldn't ignore. Eli began to sing again, the melody familiar but somehow new, as though he breathed life into every note. Isabel closed her eyes and let the sound wash over her, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. She didn't wipe them away. For once, she let herself feel. Eli's voice floated through the air like a soft breeze, carrying the familiar melody of a song Isabel hadn't heard in years. It stirred something deep within her, a whisper of a memory she had locked away long ago. "This little light of mine, I'm going to let it shine." Her feet felt rooted to the cracked sidewalk, as though if she moved, the fragile thread tying her to this moment would snap. Eli swayed as he sang, his worn coat catching the faint evening wind, his toy microphone still held tight, as though it were something sacred. His smile was so pure, so unwavering, it was as if joy itself resided in him. But Isabel's chest tightened. Suddenly, she wasn't on a bustling street corner anymore. The sounds of honking cars and rushing footsteps faded to nothing, and the air around her seemed to still. Her mind drifted, pulled gently but firmly toward another time, another place. She was 8 years old again. The air smelled of lilacs and cut grass, sunlight spilling through the kitchen window like liquid gold. There, standing on an old wooden chair in the middle of the living room, was her younger brother, David, his mop of dark curls bouncing with every move. In his tiny hands, he clutched a toy microphone, the very same kind as Eli's, battered and loved, its red plastic gleaming under the light. "This little light of mine." David's voice was high and slightly off-key, but he sang with every ounce of his small heart, his face glowing with delight. Isabel remembered how she and her mother had laughed, clapping along as David stomped his feet in rhythm. He was so confident, so free, so full of life that it was impossible not to be swept up in his joy. "Sing with me, Miri," he had called out, his voice filled with excitement. "I can't sing, David." She had giggled, embarrassed but grinning ear to ear. "Doesn't matter," he had replied stubbornly, puffing out his chest. "You just gotta let it out, Miri. Just let it shine." It was such a small moment, insignificant to anyone else, but it had stayed with her. Or at least it had, until the years buried it beneath layers of grief and time. And then David was gone. The memory fractured, the sunlight dimming. The laughter vanished, replaced by silence, the kind of silence that stretched across days, weeks, and months after they lost him. Isabel remembered the cold, clinical hospital room, her mother's quiet sobs in the middle of the night, the way her father tried to hold everything together but failed. She remembered how she had stopped singing, stopped smiling, as if any joy might betray the memory of her brother. It hurt too much to remember, so she stopped. Until now. Isabel blinked back tears, her breath shaky as she returned to the present. The sounds of the street rushed back around her like a wave, but Eli's voice remained the anchor, holding her in place. She wiped at her cheek with trembling fingers, realizing too late that she was crying. Isabel? Henry's voice jolted her like a snap of a branch. She turned, startled, and saw him standing a few steps away, his expression a mix of confusion and irritation. He had returned, perhaps to check if she had come to her senses. "What's going on?" he asked, his tone sharp but edged with something softer. Concern, perhaps, though he wouldn't admit it. Isabel couldn't speak. Her throat was too tight, her chest too full. She turned back to Eli, who was still singing, still swaying, still smiling, utterly untouched by the chaos of the world around him. "Isabel," Henry tried again, his brow furrowed. "You're crying. What's happening?" "It's nothing," she whispered hoarsely, trying to compose herself, though the tears betrayed her. "It's not nothing," Henry said, stepping closer. "You're standing here, crying in the middle of the street over some kid with a toy microphone. I don't understand." Isabel flinched at his words, though she knew he didn't mean them cruelly. Henry had always been practical. He was the man who built their life out of logic and careful planning. Emotions were messy, unpredictable, things he couldn't calculate or control. He couldn't see what she was seeing. "His song," she said quietly, turning to face her husband. "It reminds me of someone." Henry's frown deepened. "Who?" "My brother," Isabel replied, her voice breaking on the last word. "David." Henry blinked, startled. Isabel rarely spoke of her brother. In the 15 years they'd been together, she had only ever mentioned him in passing, a faint reference to her childhood before quickly changing the subject. Henry had always assumed it was just too painful, and so he never pushed. "What about him?" Henry asked gently, his frustration ebbing. Isabel swallowed hard, staring down at her hands. "He used to sing this song. He used to stand on chairs and hold his toy microphone, just like that." She gestured toward Eli, who was now starting another verse, his voice carrying over the crowd. "And he smiled like that too, like the world couldn't touch him." Henry fell silent, his expression softening as he studied his wife. He had never seen her like this, so vulnerable, so shaken. He reached out, his hand brushing her arm. "Isabel, I'm sorry. I didn't know." "You wouldn't," she interrupted softly, her voice steadier now. "I never told you. I didn't let myself remember." She turned back to Eli, who paused mid-song, his wide, innocent eyes meeting hers. "Why are you sad, lady?" he asked, his tone so sincere it nearly shattered her heart. "I'm not sad," Isabel replied, forcing a smile through her tears. I remembered something important." "Thank you, Eli." The boy beamed, as if her gratitude were the greatest gift he'd ever received. "You're welcome," he chirped, lifting his microphone again. Henry watched the exchange, his discomfort evident. He stuffed his hands into his pockets, shifting slightly on his feet. "Isabel, look," he said carefully. "I understand this is personal, but we should go. You can't just stay here all night." Isabel didn't respond right away. Her eyes stayed fixed on Eli, as though she were trying to memorize every detail. His coat, his shoes, the way his smile seemed to hold the very light he was singing about. "I'm not ready to leave," she said finally. Henry sighed, the frustration returning. "Isabel, this." "Henry," she said softly, turning to meet his gaze. "Please, just let me be here for a little while longer." Something in her tone stopped him. He sighed again, defeated. "Fine," he muttered, "but don't be long." With that, he turned and walked toward the edge of the street, pulling out his phone as if it might anchor him back to the world he understood. Isabel stayed, her heart lighter but aching, as Eli began to sing again. This time, she listened not just with her ears, but with her soul. It was as if, in that moment, David was there beside her, singing, smiling, and reminding her of the joy she had buried for so long. The city continued to move around them, blind to the small corner where Eli's song carved out a pocket of calm. People rushed by, their steps hurried, their gazes fixed forward as though they couldn't afford to look to the side. But Isabel stood still, her heels planted on the cracked sidewalk, watching Eli as if he were the only thing that mattered. The boy finished his verse, the last note carrying softly into the evening air, and for a moment, there was silence, pure and profound. Eli glanced up at her, his bright eyes full of curiosity. He tilted his head, holding his toy microphone up to his chin like a real performer. "Hi again, lady," he said cheerfully, his voice rising above the hum of passing cars. Isabel smiled, her lips trembling slightly as she wiped the remnants of tears from her cheek. "Hi, Eli." Eli grinned, puffing out his chest proudly. "You remember my name? That's pretty cool." Isabel crouched down, so she was at eye level with him, her gaze soft. Up close, she noticed the tiny freckles that dotted his cheeks and the way his dark curls framed his face like a halo. "It's a very nice name. It suits you." "Eli Timer." "Thanks." He twirled his toy microphone in his small hands. "Did you like my singing?" "I loved it," Isabel said honestly, her voice thick with emotion. "You sing beautifully." Eli's eyes shone with delight, his smile wide enough to light up the block. "That's what my mama says too," he replied. "She says I have a gift from God." Isabel's heart squeezed at the purity in his words. She glanced at the worn coat, hanging loosely from his shoulders, and the frayed cuffs that were far too long for his small arms. His mismatched shoes peeked from under his jeans, the soles barely holding together. Yet none of it seemed to matter to Eli. He was radiant, full of light and joy that no hardship could dim. "Why do you sing out here, Eli?" Isabel asked softly. Eli paused, his small fingers tracing the edge of the toy microphone as he considered her question. "Because it makes people happy," he said simply. "I like to see people smile." Isabel stared at him, her breath catching in her throat. "That's why." Eli nodded enthusiastically. "I like singing. It makes me happy too. Mama says if you're happy, you should share it. So I share my songs." Isabel felt something inside her crack open, like sunlight breaking through a wall of dark clouds. How could someone so young, so small, carry so much wisdom? Here he stood on a dirty sidewalk, with no audience except strangers rushing by, and yet he poured his heart into every word, believing, knowing, that his songs made a difference. "You're a very special boy, Eli," Isabel whispered, her voice trembling. Eli shrugged, his smile never faltering. "Mama says I'm special too." A sharp voice cut through the moment like a blade. "Isabel?" Isabel flinched, turning her head to see Henry striding toward her with barely restrained frustration. He'd stopped a short distance away, pacing like a restless lion, but now his patience had run dry. His jaw was set, his eyes dark with annoyance. "Isabel, what are you doing?" Henry demanded, his voice low but firm as he glanced between her and Eli. "We're late. Very late." Isabel rose slowly to her feet, turning to face her husband. "I know," she replied softly. But what?" Henry cut in sharply, gesturing at Eli. "You're talking to a kid who sings on the street." "Isabel, this is absurd." "It's not absurd," Isabel said, her tone calm but resolute. "He's singing to make people happy, Henry." Henry stared at her, disbelief coloring his expression. "To make people happy? Isabel, look at this place." He swept his arm toward the street, where the crowd churned past them, indifferent and detached. "No one here cares. He's just—" "Stop." Isabel's voice was quiet, but it carried an edge that made Henry freeze mid-sentence. "Stop saying that." Henry blinked at her, his anger faltering. "Saying what?" "That he's just anything," Isabel replied, her gaze steady. "He's not just a kid. He's not just singing. He's doing something most people wouldn't even dare to do. He's giving joy to a world that doesn't stop to notice." Henry let out a sharp breath, shaking his head. "Isabel, you're being dramatic. This doesn't matter. He doesn't matter. What matters is us getting to the gala and closing this deal. That's reality." "Is it?" Isabel shot back, surprising herself with the intensity in her voice. "Is that the only reality that matters to you, Henry?" Henry opened his mouth to respond, but the words seemed to catch in his throat. He looked at her as though she had become a stranger. "I don't understand you right now," he muttered. "You don't have to," Isabel said quietly, her tone softer now. but I understand him." She turned her gaze back to Eli, who stood quietly nearby, his bright eyes darting between them. He didn't look afraid or confused. He just waited, patient as ever, his toy microphone still clutched tightly in his hands. Henry ran a hand through his hair, his frustration bubbling over again. "Fine," he muttered, his voice clipped. "You stay here and listen to him sing if that's what you want. But I'm going. I have responsibilities, Isabel. Responsibilities you used to care about, too." Isabel flinched at his words, but she didn't respond. She watched as Henry turned sharply on his heel and stalked away, his silhouette quickly swallowed by the city's flow. She took a deep breath, the weight of his departure pressing against her chest, but she didn't follow him. Not this time. Eli broke the silence with his gentle voice. "Is he mad?" Isabel turned back to the boy, her expression softening. "A little," she admitted. "But he'll be okay." Eli nodded as though he understood. "Sometimes Mama gets mad too, but she says it's okay as long as you don't stay mad forever." Isabel smiled fondly. "Your Mama sounds very wise." "She is," Eli agreed proudly. Then, without skipping a beat, he lifted his microphone again. "Do you want me to sing you another song?" Isabel hesitated, her heart both heavy and light. "Yes, Eli," she said softly. "I'd like that very much." And so Eli began to sing again. His voice, clear and joyful, rose into the evening air, cutting through the noise of the city like a blade of light. Isabel closed her eyes, letting the melody fill her heart, breathing in the pure, untarnished joy of it. For the first time in years, she felt like she could breathe. The hum of the city seemed to fall away, leaving only Eli's voice filling the quiet space between them. His song ended softly, his small frame swaying slightly before he looked up, his bright eyes meeting Isabel's with unguarded innocence. Isabel felt the cool night air brushing her face as she crouched back down, closer to Eli. Her expensive heels dug into the cracked pavement, but she didn't care. Here, in this forgotten corner of the city, time slowed down, and the world's priorities, her priorities, felt strange and distant. Eli grinned, his toy microphone still clutched tightly in his small hands. "You like that one, lady?" "I did, Eli. I liked it very much," Isabel said softly. "You have a beautiful voice." Eli tilted his head, considering her words. "Mama says my voice is a gift," he said proudly. "A gift from God." The conviction in his voice made Isabel blink. "A gift?" she echoed, a smile tugging faintly at her lips. "Yup," Eli beamed, puffing out his chest a little. "Mama says not everyone gets a voice that makes people happy. So I sing, 'cause it's my job to share it. Gifts aren't just for you, they're for everyone else too." Isabel's heart clenched at the simplicity of his words. There was no hesitation, no question in Eli's mind about the purpose of his singing. He truly believed he had something to offer the world, and he gave it freely, asking for nothing in return. She sat down beside him on the edge of the sidewalk, ignoring the chill of the concrete beneath her. "Your mama sounds like a wonderful woman," she said gently. "What's her name?" "Her name's Gloria," Eli said, his smile widening at the mention of her. "She's the best mama ever. She works really hard." "What does she do?" Eli's small fingers traced the outline of the toy microphone as he spoke. "She works at a diner," he said proudly. "She makes the best pancakes and eggs. I tried to help her once, but I burned the toast." He giggled at the memory, his laughter light and infectious. Isabel couldn't help but smile. "It sounds like she's teaching you well." "Yeah," Eli nodded eagerly. "Mama says she works so I can be happy. She always says I'm her sunshine, even on days when she's tired." The words hit Isabel like a quiet blow, making her throat tighten. She glanced at the boy's shoes, one nearly worn through, and the too large coat hanging off his thin shoulders. She thought of Gloria, of the tired mother finishing another long shift, perhaps walking home with aching feet, only to find joy in the sound of her son singing. Isabel felt a pang of guilt for how much she took for granted. The pristine clothes in her walk-in closet, the home that felt more like a polished display than a place of comfort, and the dinner she barely tasted as Henry spoke of business. And yet here was Eli, full of love, gratitude, and joy, his happiness unshaken by circumstances that would leave most adults bitter. "Do you sing here every day?" Isabel asked softly. "Not every day," Eli said, swinging his legs slightly. "Sometimes Mama says it's too cold, but when I can, I come out and sing. People don't always stop, but that's okay. If just one person smiles, it's worth it." Isabel's chest ached as she watched him. "Does it make you sad when people don't listen?" Eli shrugged, his smile unwavering. "Not really. Mama says God always listens, even when nobody else does. That's enough for me." Isabel stared at him, her eyes glistening. How could a boy so young carry such wisdom, such resilience? Eli didn't seem to see the world the way everyone else did. He didn't measure success in attention or money. To him, joy was its own reward. "You're a very brave boy, Eli," Isabel whispered, her voice trembling. Eli looked up surprised. "Brave? Nah, I just sing." Isabel opened her mouth to respond, but found herself speechless. She had spent so much of her life chasing things that were fleeting: status, admiration, control. Her days had been carefully planned, each decision meant to build the life she thought she wanted. Yet here was Eli, with no plan, no expectations, just a voice and a heart full of light. "Eli," she said after a pause, "can I ask you something?" "Sure," he said brightly. "What makes you so happy? How do you stay so joyful?" Eli blinked as if the answer were obvious. "Because God gave me today," he said simply. "Mama says every day is a gift, and it's up to us to make it special. So I sing. That's how I make my days happy." Isabel looked at him, stunned by the purity of his perspective. Every day is a gift. How long had it been since she woke up feeling that way? Since she stopped to appreciate something as simple as a sunrise or the sound of laughter? Her days had been consumed with plans for tomorrow, for next week, for next year. Always pushing forward, never stopping to see the beauty in where she already was. She felt tears sting her eyes again, though she blinked them back quickly. "Your mama must be very proud of you, Eli," she said quietly. Eli's grin grew even wider. "I think so. She always says she's lucky to have me. But really, I'm a lucky one. I got the best mama ever." Isabel's heart broke and healed all at once. She thought of Henry and their life together. How he pushed her to be practical, to strive for more, to never settle. She had once admired those qualities in him because she believed they were what made a person successful. But sitting here, on the sidewalk beside a little boy who had nothing but his voice and a heart full of love, she wondered if she had been wrong all along. "Thank you, Eli," she whispered suddenly, surprising even herself. Eli blinked, his small face filled with curiosity. "For what?" "For reminding me of something important," Isabel replied softly. Eli shrugged modestly, as if what he had done was nothing at all. "You're welcome, lady." Isabel stayed seated beside him for a long moment, watching the city move around them as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But in her heart, something had shifted, something she couldn't ignore. Far off in the distance, a clock chimed the hour. The sound seemed to pull her reluctantly back to reality. She glanced toward the street where Henry had disappeared, guilt tugging at the edges of her mind. She would have to face him soon, explain why she had chosen to stay behind. But for now, Isabel stayed where she was, listening as Eli started another song. "This little light of mine, I'm going to let it shine." And for the first time in years, Isabel felt that light stirring within her too. The streetlights flickered above Isabel, casting pools of yellow light onto the cracked pavement. Eli's voice, soft but unwavering, continued to echo into the night as if it could hold back the chaos of the city forever. Isabel remained seated beside him, her expensive ivory suit now creased, her once pristine heels scuffed against the sidewalk. Yet for the first time in years, she didn't care. Isabel wrapped her arms around her knees, gazing out into the blurred motion of traffic and pedestrians, all moving at a pace she could no longer keep up with. The noise and hurry of the world felt so far away. Her thoughts lingered on Eli's words. Every day is a gift, and it's up to us to make it special. When had she stopped seeing life that way? She thought about her days, carefully regimented, every hour planned to the minute. Meetings, galas, calls, decisions, all in pursuit of more. More wealth, more security, more success. Henry was so good at reminding her of what they needed to achieve, how far they had come and how far they still had to go. Yet here she was sitting on a cold sidewalk with a boy who had none of that, and she felt full. Full of something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. Purpose, connection, joy. She looked at her reflection in the nearby shop window, a silhouette of a woman who once had dreams of her own. She remembered the younger version of herself, before life with Henry, before the gala circuits and boardroom meetings. Back then, she wanted to help people. Maybe she hadn't known exactly how, but she had promised herself she would leave the world better than she found it. Somewhere along the way, she had traded that promise for a shiny, empty version of success. A voice pulled her from her thoughts. Isabel. Henry's voice was sharp, but Isabel could hear the underlying exhaustion in it. She turned her head and saw him striding toward her, his pace slower now, his eyes fixed on her as though he couldn't quite believe she was still here. His charcoal suit looked slightly rumpled now. His tie loosened as if he'd finally given up trying to contain his frustration. He stopped a few feet away, hands braced on his hips as he surveyed the scene. The upscale woman crouched beside a street kid holding a plastic microphone. Isabel, what are you doing? Henry asked, his voice edged with disbelief. I'm listening, she replied softly. To what? Henry scoffed, glancing at Eli, who was now humming quietly to himself. The kid still singing? Isabel, this has gone far enough. Isabel rose slowly to her feet, her legs stiff from sitting. She turned to face her husband, her gaze calm but steady. Has it? Yes, it has, Henry replied, his frustration bubbling back to the surface. We're late, Isabel. Do you know how ridiculous this is going to sound when I tell Langley why we didn't show up on time? Because my wife decided to sit on the sidewalk and listen to a... Don't! Isabel interrupted sharply, her voice surprising even herself. Henry blinked, startled by the force behind her words. Don't dismiss him, she said, her tone quieter but still firm. Don't dismiss this. Henry exhaled, his hand running through his hair. I don't understand you right now. This isn't you, Isabel. You don't just throw away our plans. Our goals. Isabel's expression softened, and she took a deep breath, her gaze searching his face. Maybe you don't know me as well as you think. Henry. His brows furrowed. What's that supposed to mean? It means I'm not sure this is who I want to be anymore. Henry stared at her as if she had spoken another language. You don't mean that. I do, Isabel said quietly. Henry, I sat here and listened to Eli sing, and for the first time in years, I felt real. I felt like I could breathe. Do you know how long it's been since I felt that way? Henry opened his mouth to respond, but hesitated, caught off guard by the crack in her voice. Isabel, we've built a life, a good life, one that most people only dream about. You're going to throw that away because of a kid singing on a street corner? I'm not throwing anything away, she said, shaking her head. But I can't pretend anymore. I can't pretend that our life, our plans have been enough for me. I've been empty for so long, Henry, and I didn't even realize it until tonight. Empty, Henry repeated, disbelief hardening his tone. We have everything, Isabel. You have everything. Do I? Isabel asked, her voice breaking slightly. Do we? Because I look at us, and all I see is two people running in the same direction, but going nowhere. Chasing something that doesn't even make us happy anymore. Henry's face fell, his frustration giving way to something closer to hurt. We've worked so hard for this, he said quietly, his voice almost pleading. You and me, together. We set goals, Isabel. We agreed on what we wanted. Did all of that mean nothing to you? It meant something, she whispered, her throat tight. But it's not enough anymore. I thought it was, but... She trailed off, her gaze drifting back to Eli, who was now sitting on the edge of the sidewalk, swinging his legs as he quietly hummed. The simplicity of his joy struck her again like a blow to the heart. That little boy, Isabel continued softly. He has nothing, Henry. Nothing but his voice. And he sings to make people happy. To make himself happy. And I realized I don't even know what makes me happy anymore. Henry's expression was unreadable, his lips pressed into a tight line. And what are you saying, Isabel? That you want to abandon our life? That you want to throw away everything we've worked for because some kid on the street made you feel something? Isabel turned to him, her gaze steady. I'm saying I want to figure out what really matters. I want to live for something more than a balance sheet or a gala or a deal that will never bring us peace. Henry shook his head, his frustration rising again. That's not fair. You're acting like I don't care about us. About you. I know you care, Henry, Isabel said, her voice soft but resolute. But I don't think you understand what I need right now. I don't even know if I fully understand it myself. But I know that tonight, it's a turning point for me. I can't ignore it. Henry's shoulders sagged as he looked at her, defeated. He opened his mouth, but no words came. After a long silence, he turned his gaze toward Eli, who looked up and waved innocently, still smiling as if nothing had happened. I don't understand you, Isabel, Henry muttered finally, his voice low and tired. I really don't. Isabel felt her chest tighten as she watched her husband, her partner in everything, turn and walk away again, disappearing into the crowd without another word. She let him go. Isabel turned back to Eli, who was watching her curiously. Is he mad at you? Eli asked, his voice soft. Isabel smiled faintly, her eyes misty. Maybe a little, she said. Eli shrugged, his smile returning. He'll get happy again. My mama says people can't stay mad forever. Isabel laughed softly, wiping at her cheek. You're a very wise boy, Eli. Eli beamed. I just listen to Mama. Isabel took a deep breath, her gaze lingering on the boy who had turned her world upside down with nothing but a song. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for now, she knew one thing for certain. She couldn't go back to the life she had before. The city's bustle began to quiet as the evening deepened, the glow of neon signs casting patches of color on the pavement. Isabel remained seated beside Eli, her heels discarded and her legs stretched out in front of her, her once crisp ivory suit now speckled with dirt from the sidewalk. She didn't care. Time felt irrelevant here, as though Eli's singing had created a sanctuary where the rest of the world couldn't intrude. Eli hummed quietly beside her, tapping his toy microphone against his knee in a rhythmic pattern. The sound was light and comforting, as if he were serenading the stars themselves. You don't get tired of singing, do you? Isabel asked softly, smiling as she watched him. Eli shook his head enthusiastically. No, singing makes me happy, so I don't get tired. Mama says that when you're doing something you love, it's like your heart doesn't need a rest. Isabel's heart clenched again at the mention of his mother, the love in Eli's voice so clear and genuine. She hadn't even met the woman, but through Eli's stories, she felt like she knew a piece of her already, Gloria, a woman who worked hard for her boy and loved him fiercely. As the last note of Eli's quiet hum faded, they both heard the faint sound of footsteps approaching. Isabel looked up, and there, emerging from the shadows of the street, was a woman. Eli's eyes lit up instantly. Mama, he cried, jumping to his feet so quickly that his toy microphone tumbled to the ground. The woman, Gloria, hurried forward, her steps quick but tired, her face drawn with exhaustion. She was small in stature, her shoulders slightly hunched as though carrying the weight of 1,000 days just like this one. Her clothes were simple, black jeans and a worn, faded jacket zipped halfway up. Her dark curls were pulled back hastily, and her face, though lined with fatigue, softened the moment she saw Eli. Gloria called out, relief flooding her voice as she knelt down, arms open wide. Eli rushed to her, flinging himself into her embrace. She wrapped her arms around him tightly, pressing kisses into the top of his head as if she needed to reassure herself that he was safe and whole. You had me so worried, Gloria murmured softly, her voice trembling. I told you not to stay out too late, sweet boy. Eli pulled back slightly, his face beaming. I was singing, Mama, and this lady stayed to listen to me. He turned and pointed toward Isabel, who had risen to her feet, holding her shoes loosely in one hand. Gloria's eyes shifted to Isabel, and her face flickered with a mix of surprise, caution, and gratitude. She stood slowly, her arm still draped protectively around Eli's small shoulders. "Thank you," Gloria said quietly, her voice soft but strong. "Thank you for staying with him. I hope he wasn't bothering you." Isabel stepped forward, her gaze kind. "Not at all," she said sincerely. "He was a gift tonight, more than he knows." Gloria looked down at Eli, her lips curling into a small smile. "That's my boy," she said fondly, "always sharing his songs." Isabel studied the woman in front of her. Gloria's face showed signs of long days and little rest, the kind of weariness that no amount of sleep could erase. Yet there was no bitterness in her expression, just love and quiet resolve. She held herself with a dignity that didn't need words, her strength evident in the way she stood tall despite everything life had thrown at her. "You must be Gloria," Isabel said softly. Gloria nodded. "Yes, and this little troublemaker is mine." She squeezed Eli's shoulder gently, earning a giggle from him. "I'm sorry if he kept you too long." Isabel shook her head, her smile warm but wistful. "I'm glad he did. I think I needed to hear his voice more than I realized." Gloria's eyes softened, and for a moment, the two women regarded each other in silence. It wasn't awkward or forced. It was a moment of understanding, as though an invisible bridge had formed between them. "Eli talks about you a lot," Isabel added after a pause. "He says you're his hero." Gloria laughed softly, though her eyes glistened with emotion. "He's too kind to me. I just do what I can. It's not easy, you know, but he's worth every second of it." Isabel's throat tightened as she thought about what Gloria's life must be like. Working long hours at a diner, worrying about bills, coming home late to a child who still saw her as a source of light. It was a life so far removed from Isabel's own, yet one that suddenly seemed so much richer in ways she had never considered. "How do you do it?" Isabel asked quietly, surprising herself with the question. Gloria raised an eyebrow, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Do what?" "Keep going. Stay so strong," Isabel clarified, her voice soft. Gloria shrugged gently, her hand brushing over Eli's curls. "When you love someone, you find a way. Even on the hardest days, you just keep putting one foot in front of the other." She glanced down at Eli, her voice dropping to a whisper. "He's my light. That's how I do it." Isabel felt tears sting the corners of her eyes again, but she blinked them back quickly. She had spent years surrounded by luxury and comfort, yet hearing Gloria speak made her realize how hollow her own life had become. She had been chasing an illusion of happiness, but it was here, in the most unexpected of places, that she finally saw what real love and purpose looked like. "I think he's a light for more people than you realize," Isabel said softly, glancing at Eli, who was now humming quietly to himself. Gloria smiled, though a faint shadow crossed her face. "Maybe, but the world doesn't always see him that way." Isabel understood immediately what she meant. A boy like Eli, bright, innocent, and born different, was too often overlooked, dismissed, or pitted. Yet here he was, singing into the night with more joy and resilience than most people ever found. "He's extraordinary," Isabel said firmly. "Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." Gloria looked at Isabel then, truly looked at her, and something unspoken passed between them, a shared understanding, a mutual respect. "Thank you," Gloria murmured, her voice thick with emotion. Isabel took a deep breath, her chest rising with a newfound sense of clarity. She had spent so long living a life that felt important, but had no real substance, and now, in this brief encounter, everything she thought she knew had shifted. Gloria squeezed Eli's hand gently. "Come on, sweetheart. Let's go home." Eli turned to Isabel, his face glowing. "Will you come listen again sometime?" Isabel smiled, her heart full. "I'd love that, Eli." As they walked away, Gloria's arms still wrapped protectively around Eli. Isabel watched them until they disappeared around the corner. The boy's humming lingered in the air long after they were gone, a melody she would carry with her. Isabel slipped her heels back on, her gaze drifting toward the street where Henry had disappeared earlier. For the first time, she felt sure of something. She couldn't return to the life she had been living. She needed to live differently, purposefully. And tonight, on this cracked and crowded sidewalk, she had found the first step forward. The apartment was quiet when Isabel pushed the door open. The soft hum of the city lingered outside, muffled by the heavy walls of the building. She stepped inside, pausing as the familiar space enveloped her. The pristine white walls, the sleek leather furniture, and the faint scent of fresh flowers from the centerpiece Henry insisted on keeping in the foyer. It was perfect, every corner curated to project success, comfort, and control. But tonight, the place felt hollow. She slipped off her shoes, carrying them in her hand as she walked through the living room. The soft click of the door closing behind her echoed louder than it should have. Across the room, she spotted Henry sitting on the edge of the couch, his head in his hands. His phone sat next to him on the table, its screen dark. The moment he looked up, his eyes caught hers, tired, frustrated, but also searching. For a long beat, neither of them said anything. "Where have you been?" Henry finally asked, his voice low, not sharp like before, but heavy with exhaustion. Isabel placed her shoes down carefully beside the couch and straightened, folding her arms. "I told you. I stayed with Eli." Henry blinked, confusion flickering across his face. "That boy again?" He ran a hand down his face and shook his head. "Isabel, what is this about? What's happening to you?" "I don't know if I can explain it in a way you'll understand," she replied softly, her voice steady despite the tremor she felt inside. Henry stood abruptly, pacing in front of the couch. "Try," he demanded. "Because I don't get it, Isabel. I don't get you. We were supposed to go to the gala together. Together. This was important. Our future, our business connections, everything we've worked for." "Everything you've worked for," Isabel corrected gently, though her words hit like a sharp blade. Henry froze mid-step and turned to face her, his expression a mix of disbelief and hurt. "What's that supposed to mean?" Isabel sighed, running her hand through her hair as she tried to gather her thoughts. "Henry, for years I've followed you, followed us down this path. The galas, the meetings, the carefully planned life. I thought it was what I wanted. But tonight," she paused, her gaze dropping to the floor. "Tonight, everything felt different. Because of him?" Henry's voice rose, laced with frustration. "Because of some street kid with a plastic microphone?" "It's not just about Eli," Isabel shot back, her own voice growing firmer now. "It's about me, about realizing how much I've buried, how much I've ignored. That little boy showed me something, Henry, something I didn't want to see until now." Henry stepped closer, his brow furrowed, his tone desperate now. "Isabel, we have everything. Everything we ever wanted. What more do you need?" Isabel met his gaze, her own steady but filled with sadness. "I need more than this," she whispered. "More than money and empty connections. I need purpose, Henry. I need to feel like what I'm doing matters." His face twisted as though her words were a physical blow. "So our life, this life, doesn't matter to you?" Isabel shook her head quickly, tears pricking her eyes. "That's not what I'm saying. I love you, and I care about what we've built. But can't you see how hollow it's become? We've spent so long chasing success that we forgot why we wanted it in the first place. We forgot what happiness looks like." "Happiness?" Henry scoffed, throwing his hands up in exasperation. "Isabel, you're romanticizing some kid's song. You can't let one moment derail everything we've worked for." "It's not one moment," she said firmly, her voice breaking slightly. "It's all the moments we've been missing. Every smile we didn't share, every opportunity to connect with something real that we let pass us by because we were too busy being important. Eli's song just woke me up." Henry stared at her, his jaw tight, his fists clenching and unclenching at his sides. "And what does that mean for us, Isabel? Are you saying you want to walk away? From me? From everything?" Isabel swallowed hard, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. "I don't want to walk away from you," she whispered. "But I can't keep living like this, pretending everything is fine when I know it isn't. Something has to change." Henry turned away from her, his shoulders sagging as he ran both hands through his hair. "Change?" he muttered bitterly. "Change to what? Do you want to throw away our lives and sing on a street corner too?" "That's not fair," Isabel said, her voice cracking. "I'm not asking for something ridiculous, Henry. I just need to find something that fills me up, Something that gives me the same peace I saw in Eli tonight. Henry turned back to her, his eyes blazing with emotion. And what about me? What happens to me while you're off chasing what? Fulfillment? Meaning? Isabel stepped closer, her voice soft but unwavering. I want you to come with me, to try and see what I see, to feel what I felt tonight. Henry stared at her for a long moment, his chest rising and falling with uneven breaths. And if I can't? Isabel's heart clenched at the question. She knew how much Henry valued control, structure, and certainty. He had spent his entire life climbing higher, and now she was asking him to look down and question if the climb had been worth it. I don't know, she admitted softly, her voice breaking. But I can't ignore this. I can't pretend anymore. Henry turned away again, walking slowly toward the window. He stared out into the night, his back to her, his posture stiff and unmoving. The silence in the room was deafening. Isabel wiped at her tears, her breath shaky as she waited. She didn't know what he would say, what he would decide. All she knew was that she couldn't turn back now. Finally, Henry spoke, his voice quiet but strained. I need time. Isabel nodded, though he couldn't see her. Take all the time you need, she said softly. Henry stayed by the window, his figure silhouetted against the city lights, and Isabel knew he was wrestling with a world that no longer made sense to him. She walked toward the bedroom, her steps slow and deliberate, her heart heavy but resolute. As she passed the living room table, her gaze fell on a framed photo of her and Henry at a gala from years before. They looked perfect, polished, smiling, the image of success. But it wasn't enough anymore. Isabel picked up the photo, her fingers grazing the edge of the frame. Something has to change, she whispered again, more to herself than to anyone else. And for the first time in years, she felt ready to face whatever came next. Sunlight filtered softly through the sheer curtains as Isabel opened her eyes. For a moment, she simply lay still, letting the warmth of the morning wash over her. The apartment was quiet, save for the faint hum of traffic outside, a stark contrast to the emotional chaos of the night before. Her mind felt clearer, lighter, as if some invisible weight had lifted. The memories of the previous night, the look on Eli's face, the strength in Gloria's words, and the hurt in Henry's eyes, played gently through her thoughts. There was no turning back now. She had made her choice. Rising from the bed, she stepped over to the window, where the city stretched out in all its indifferent beauty. It was a world she had spent years navigating with precision, where every decision had been calculated for success. But for the first time, success didn't feel like the end goal. It felt hollow, without purpose. As she sipped a cup of coffee in the quiet kitchen, her phone buzzed softly against the counter. Isabel glanced down to see a message from Henry. We need to talk. I'm in the living room. She set the cup down, exhaling a slow, steady breath. Last night had ended in uncertainty, but the fact that Henry was willing to talk, willing to try, gave her a sliver of hope. She crossed the apartment with quiet steps, finding Henry sitting on the couch, his gaze fixed on the skyline outside. He turned as she entered. His expression was no longer angry or defensive. It was softer, lined with something deeper, vulnerability. Isabel sat across from him, her hands resting on her knees, waiting for him to speak first. I didn't sleep much, Henry admitted finally, his voice quieter than she was used to. I kept thinking about what you said, about the life we've built. Isabel nodded gently. And Henry sighed, his fingers lacing together as he looked at her. It's not that I don't understand what you're saying, Isabel. I just don't know how to let go of what we've been working for. Henry, Isabel began softly, leaning forward, I'm not asking you to let go of everything. I'm asking you to see it differently. To see that there's more to life than just building things, money, status, reputation. None of it means anything if it doesn't fill us up inside. Henry's shoulders slumped slightly, and he looked down at his hands. What are you suggesting we do? Isabel hesitated for a moment, carefully choosing her words. I want to help people like Eli and Gloria. There are so many families out there who work tirelessly just to survive, families with so much love, so much hope, but no support. We have the resources, Henry. We can make a real difference. Henry met her gaze, his brow furrowing. How? I don't know all the details yet, Isabel admitted, a small smile tugging at her lips. But I want to start by helping kids like Eli. I want to create opportunities, maybe through education, music programs, or support for families raising children with special needs. People like Gloria shouldn't have to carry that weight alone. And kids like Eli should have a chance to shine. Henry leaned back against the couch, running a hand through his hair. For a long moment, he didn't speak, and Isabel could see the internal war playing out behind his eyes. Henry had always been practical, driven, and skeptical of anything that didn't yield measurable results. But beneath all of that, she knew there was a man with a good heart, a man who could understand, if he let himself. Finally, he sighed, his voice low. "You're really serious about this, aren't you?" Isabel smiled fondly. "I've never been more serious about anything." Henry shook his head, a mixture of disbelief and reluctant admiration flickering across his face. "You're going to turn our lives upside down, you know that?" Isabel laughed softly. "Maybe it's time we did." He was quiet for a moment, staring at her as if trying to see inside her soul. Then, slowly he nodded. "Okay," he said, his voice steady. "I'll support you, Isabel. I don't know if I completely understand yet, but I'll try." Tears pricked at Isabel's eyes as she stood and crossed the room, wrapping her arms around him tightly. "That's all I need," she whispered, "just for you to try." The following weeks were a whirlwind. Isabel threw herself into research, meetings, and planning, pouring her heart into understanding the challenges that families like Gloria's faced every day. She visited community centers, spoke to mothers and teachers, and met with advocates for children with special needs. For the first time in years, her days were no longer defined by empty ambition, but by something that felt real. Henry, though cautious, began to see the change in her. The way her eyes lit up when she spoke about the family she wanted to help, the joy she found in working towards something meaningful. Slowly, he began to join her, attending meetings and asking questions. One day, as they walked through a modest music program for underprivileged kids, Henry leaned over and whispered, "I get it now, Isabel. I really do." She turned to him, smiling, and for the first time in a long time, she felt like they were walking the same path again, side by side. Months later, Isabel stood at the edge of a newly renovated music room in a community center. The walls were painted a cheerful blue, and the space was filled with instruments, guitars, keyboards, tambourines, and microphones. Kids laughed and played, their small hands eagerly exploring the instruments. In the corner of the room, she spotted Eli, standing tall with his toy microphone replaced by a real one. He grinned at her, his bright eyes still filled with that unshakable joy. Beside him, Gloria watched with tears in her eyes, her shoulders less weighed down than before. Isabel felt her throat tighten as she watched Eli lift the microphone to his lips. His voice rose, pure and clear, filling the room with a melody that seemed to hang in the air like sunlight. The children around him clapped, joining in with their own instruments, their laughter and music blending together in perfect harmony. Isabel closed her eyes for a moment, letting the sound wash over her. She thought about all the nights she had spent in boardrooms, at galas, in endless meetings chasing a dream that had left her empty. And now, here she stood, surrounded by joy, purpose, and hope. She opened her eyes, her gaze landing on Eli again. His voice had become a symbol to her, a reminder of what truly mattered. A simple boy with a simple song had changed her life, opening her heart to a truth she had been blind to for so long. Joy is found in the small, genuine moments, and purpose comes from sharing that joy with others. As Henry stepped up beside her, taking her hand gently in his, she smiled through the tears. "This is just the beginning," she whispered. He nodded, squeezing her hand. "And it's a good beginning." Together, they stood in that room filled with music and laughter, knowing that this was the life they were meant to build. And as Eli's voice carried on, it echoed in Isabel's heart as a promise. A life filled with purpose. A life worth living. This story reminds us that in a world often consumed by wealth and success, we can lose sight of what truly matters: joy, love, and human connection. Isabel's journey highlights how the smallest moments, like a child's song, can awaken something buried within us and inspire real change. The story also touches on themes of resilience, gratitude, and the power of simple acts. Eli, despite his circumstances, teaches a profound lesson. When we share our gifts, no matter how small, they can light up the lives of others. True success lies not in what we accumulate, but in how we impact the world around us. Thank you so much for listening to the end of this story. If it touched your heart, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and join us for more inspiring and heartfelt stories to come. Your support means the world to us.